The gymnasium lights flickered against the polished floors, casting long shadows across rows of empty chairs. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm, the calm that settles over a place where something life-changing is about to unfold. In the corner of that vast space, a man knelt beside a mop bucket, his weathered hands wringing out dirty water, his shoulders bent from years of labor that no one ever seemed to notice. His name was Daniel Torres, and on this particular evening in late autumn, he had no idea that everything he had quietly built in the shadows was about to step into the light. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The story you're about to hear is not just about triumph. It's about the quiet battles fought by those the world refuses to see, the strength it takes to keep showing up when everyone around you has already decided you don't matter. It's about a father who gave everything, a boy who was drowning, and a moment that proved that worth has nothing to do with the title on your office door. If you believe that hard work, sacrifice, and the courage to stand up for what's right still mean something in this world, then this story is for you. Daniel Torres had been cleaning Lincoln Prep Academy for nearly 8 years. It was a private school nestled in the wealthy suburbs of Riverside, Connecticut, where the children of executives, doctors, and lawyers arrived each morning in cars that cost more than most people earned in a year. The hallways smelled of expensive floor polish and privilege, the kind of place where futures were assumed, not fought for. Daniel arrived before dawn every day, pushing his cart through silent corridors, emptying trash bins, overflowing with half-eaten lunches that cost more than his own grocery budget for the week. He was a single father. His wife, Maria, had passed away 4 years earlier from cancer, leaving him alone to raise their daughter, Sophia, who was now 12 and attending the local public school across town. Every evening after his shift ended, Daniel would pick her up from the after-school program, help her with homework at the small kitchen table in their one-bedroom apartment, and tuck her in before preparing for another early morning. His life was a cycle of work, sacrifice, and quiet endurance. He didn't complain. Complaining required energy he didn't have, and besides, who would listen? The other staff members at Lincoln Prep rarely spoke to him. To them, he was part of the scenery, no different from the expensive art hanging in the administrative wing or the marble fountain in the main courtyard. The teachers passed him in the hallways without acknowledgement. The students barely glanced his way, except when they dropped something and expected him to pick it up. Daniel had learned long ago that invisibility was the price of survival in a world that measured people by their bank accounts and job titles. But Daniel had a secret, one that no one at Lincoln Prep knew about. Before Maria got sick, before medical bills consumed every dollar they had saved, before he dropped out of graduate school to take any job that would keep food on the table, Daniel had been 3 semesters away from earning his master's degree in mathematics. He had loved numbers the way some people loved music, seeing patterns and solutions where others saw chaos. In his tiny apartment, tucked away in a cardboard box beneath his bed, were notebooks filled with equations, lesson plans he had once dreamed of teaching, and acceptance letters to PhD programs he never got to attend. He still loved learning. Late at night, after Sophia fell asleep, Daniel would sit at the kitchen table with library books, teaching himself new concepts, keeping his mind sharp even as his body ached from scrubbing floors and lifting trash bags. He told himself it was just a hobby, a way to remember who he used to be. He never imagined that this quiet passion would become the bridge between 2 worlds that were never supposed to meet. It started on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Daniel was cleaning the 3rd-floor classrooms when he heard raised voices coming from the principal's office. The door was slightly ajar, and though he tried not to listen, the words were impossible to ignore. A man's voice, sharp with frustration, cut through the air like broken glass. The principal, Mrs. Patterson, responded in measured tones, trying to calm the situation, but the anger in the other voice only grew louder. Daniel recognized that voice. It belonged to Richard Callaway, the CEO of Callaway Enterprises, one of the largest real estate development firms on the East Coast. His son, Ethan, was a junior at Lincoln Prep, a quiet boy who kept to himself and always seemed to be carrying the weight of impossible expectations. Daniel had seen Ethan in the hallways over the years, noticed how the other students kept their distance, how he ate lunch alone in the library rather than in the crowded cafeteria. There was something fragile about the boy, something that reminded Daniel of a glass sculpture balanced on the edge of a shelf, beautiful, but always one tremor away from shattering. The argument continued. Richard Callaway was furious because Ethan was failing his advanced calculus class, not just struggling, but genuinely failing, with grades so low that his chances of getting into an Ivy League university were evaporating. For someone like Richard Callaway, whose entire identity was built on success and legacy, this was unacceptable. He demanded that the school provide a private tutor, someone who could fix the problem immediately. Mrs. Patterson explained that the school's tutoring program was already at capacity, and finding someone qualified on such short notice would be nearly impossible. Daniel continued mopping, moving slowly past the office door, his head down, his presence as unremarkable as always. But inside his mind was working. He knew advanced calculus. He had not only studied it, but had tutored other graduate students back when he was in school. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He understood the concepts, could break them down into digestible pieces, could help someone who was struggling find their way through the confusion. But he also knew that someone like Richard Callaway would never consider someone like him, a custodian offering to tutor a CEO's son. The idea was laughable, offensive even. Days passed. Daniel watched as Ethan's shoulders seemed to sink lower with each passing afternoon. The boy would sit alone in the library after school, staring at his calculus textbook with a look of quiet desperation that Daniel recognized all too well. It was the look of someone who was drowning, but had been told that asking for help was a sign of weakness. Daniel had seen that same look in the mirror during the darkest days after Maria's death, when the world expected him to keep functioning even as his heart was breaking. One evening, as Daniel was emptying the trash in the library, Ethan was still there, long after most students had gone home. His calculus book lay open in front of him, covered in eraser marks and crossed-out attempts at solving problems. Tears of frustration glistened in the boy's eyes, though he tried to hide them by turning his face toward the window. Daniel hesitated. He knew he should just finish his work and leave. Getting involved in the lives of students, especially the children of powerful parents, was dangerous territory for someone in his position. One complaint, one misunderstanding, and he could lose the job that kept a roof over Sophia's head. But something in that moment pulled at him. Maybe it was the memory of his own struggles, or the way Ethan reminded him of every young person who had ever been told they weren't good enough. Maybe it was simply that Daniel understood what it felt like to be invisible and assumed that everyone else felt the same way. Whatever the reason, he found himself walking over to Ethan's table, his voice quiet and respectful. He asked if Ethan needed help. The boy looked up, startled, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan glanced down at his textbook, at the impossible mess of numbers and symbols that seemed to mock him, and nodded. Daniel pulled up a chair. He didn't announce that he had almost completed a master's degree in mathematics. He didn't explain his background or credentials. He simply looked at the problem Ethan was struggling with and began to explain it in a way that made sense, breaking down complex concepts into smaller, manageable steps. Ethan listened. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, someone was explaining calculus in a way that didn't make him feel stupid. Daniel's patience was infinite. When Ethan didn't understand something, Daniel found another way to explain it, using real-world examples and simple language instead of academic jargon. They worked through 3 problems together before the library's closing time. When they finished, Ethan looked at Daniel with something close to hope in his eyes and asked if they could do this again. Daniel agreed, though a voice in the back of his mind warned him that this arrangement couldn't last. They began meeting twice a week after school, tucked away in the corner of the library where no one paid attention to the custodian and the struggling student. Daniel never asked for payment. He never mentioned it to anyone. This wasn't about recognition or reward. It was about helping a kid who needed it, about using the knowledge he carried to make a difference in someone's life, even if that difference would never be acknowledged. Over the following week, something remarkable happened. Ethan's understanding of calculus began to shift. The concepts that had once seemed impossible started to click into place. His test scores improved, slowly at first, then more dramatically. He stopped eating lunch alone in the library and started joining study groups, explaining problems to other students with a confidence that hadn't existed before. Daniel watched this transformation from a distance, feeling a quiet satisfaction that he hadn't experienced in years. He was making a difference, even if no one knew it. But secrets in small communities rarely stay hidden forever. It was mid-November when everything changed. Ethan's calculus teacher, Mr. Bennett, noticed the dramatic improvement in his work and called him in for a conference. Concerned that the boy might be cheating or receiving inappropriate help, he questioned Ethan about how he had managed to turn his grades around so completely. Ethan, proud of his progress and grateful for Daniel's help, told the truth. He explained that the school custodian had been tutoring him, that Daniel knew more about mathematics than anyone else Ethan had ever met. Mr. Bennett was skeptical. A custodian teaching advanced calculus. It seemed absurd. But when he looked through Ethan's recent work, he saw genuine understanding, not memorized formulas or copied solutions. The boy had actually learned the material. Still, the situation was irregular, and Mr. Bennett felt obligated to report it to Mrs. Patterson. Within days, the story had spread through the faculty lounge, whispered with a mixture of disbelief and condescension. The custodian thinks he's a teacher. Can you imagine? Richard Calloway heard about it from Mrs. Patterson during a scheduled meeting about Ethan's progress. His initial reaction was fury. The idea that his son had been receiving help from a janitor, that Ethan had kept this secret for weeks, felt like a betrayal of everything Richard stood for. He had paid top dollar for tutors with impressive credentials, and his son had rejected them all in favor of a man who cleaned toilets for a living. It was embarrassing, humiliating even. He demanded a meeting with Daniel, not to thank him, but to put an end to this ridiculous arrangement. Mrs. Patterson scheduled it for the following Friday afternoon in her office. Daniel received the notice with a sinking feeling in his stomach. He knew what this meeting would be about. He had overstepped, crossed a boundary that people like him weren't supposed to cross. He considered not showing up, just quietly disappearing from Ethan's life the way he had been taught to disappear from everything else. But something in him refused to hide this time. He had done nothing wrong. He had helped a struggling student, used his knowledge for good, and if that made powerful people uncomfortable, then maybe they needed to examine why. Friday arrived with a gray sky that matched Daniel's mood perfectly. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing through possible scenarios of how the meeting would unfold. Sophia had noticed his distraction during breakfast, asking him twice if everything was okay. He had smiled and assured her it was just work stuff, nothing to worry about. But the knot in his stomach told a different story. As he drove to Lincoln Prep that morning, his hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, his jaw clenched with an anxiety he couldn't shake. The school felt different that day. Or perhaps it was just Daniel who felt different, suddenly hyper-aware of every glance from teachers passing in the hallways, every whispered conversation that seemed to stop when he approached. He went through his morning routine mechanically, emptying trash cans and mopping floors with none of his usual care for detail. His mind was elsewhere, preparing for the confrontation he knew was coming, rehearsing words that would likely never leave his mouth. People like Richard Calloway didn't listen to people like him. That was simply the way the world worked. The meeting was scheduled for 3 o'clock in Mrs. Patterson's office. Daniel spent the hours leading up to it in a state of quiet dread, checking his watch every few minutes, as if slowing down time might somehow change what was about to happen. At 2:45, he washed his hands thoroughly in the custodial closet, changed out of his work uniform into the clean shirt he kept in his locker for parent-teacher conferences he sometimes attended for Sophia, and made his way to the administrative wing. His reflection in the polished windows showed a man who looked older than his 42 years. Lines of exhaustion etched deep around his eyes, grey threading through his dark hair at the temples. Mrs. Patterson's office was located at the end of a long corridor, decorated with photographs of distinguished alumni, successful graduates who had gone on to become senators, CEOs, best-selling authors, and renowned scientists. Their faces smiled down from expensive frames, reminders of the kind of future that Lincoln Prep promised to its students. Daniel had walked past these photographs countless times while cleaning, never once imagining that his own story would intersect with the legacy these walls celebrated. He was just the person who kept those frames dust-free, who made sure the floors beneath them gleamed, who existed in the margins of this world of achievement. The door to the office was closed when he arrived. Daniel stood in the hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs, his palms damp with nervous sweat. Through the frosted glass, he could see shadows moving, hear muffled voices engaged in conversation. He raised his hand to knock, but hesitated, suddenly aware of how presumptuous it felt for someone like him to simply walk into a meeting with the principal and one of the school's most powerful parents. In his years at Lincoln Prep, he had never been invited to sit down in Mrs. Patterson's office. He had cleaned it hundreds of times, but always when it was empty, always as a background presence that came and went without acknowledgement. Before he could knock, the door swung open. Mrs. Patterson stood there, her expression carefully neutral, the kind of practiced professionalism that principals develop over years of navigating difficult conversations. She was a woman in her late 50s, always impeccably dressed, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob and reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. She had never been unkind to Daniel, but neither had she ever been particularly warm. He was simply part of the staff, a necessary function of the school's operation, nothing more. She gestured for him to come in. Daniel stepped through the doorway and immediately felt the weight of Richard Calloway's presence. The man stood near the window, his back to the room, staring out at the athletic fields where students were practicing soccer in the cool autumn afternoon. He was tall, probably 6'2", with broad shoulders that filled out his expensive suit jacket perfectly. His hair was dark, with distinguished streaks of silver at the sides, styled with the kind of casual perfection that required significant effort to achieve. Everything about him radiated power, success, and the absolute certainty that he was the most important person in any room he entered. Mrs. Patterson closed the door behind Daniel and gestured toward one of the chairs positioned in front of her desk. Daniel sat down, his hands folded in his lap, his posture straight despite the exhaustion he felt. Richard Calloway remained standing at the window, not bothering to turn around, as if Daniel's presence was barely worth acknowledging. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and deliberate, a power play that Daniel recognized immediately. This was how men like Calloway established dominance, by making others wait, by demonstrating that their time was valuable while everyone else's was disposable. Mrs. Patterson settled into her chair behind the desk and cleared her throat. She began by thanking Daniel for coming to the meeting, her tone formal and cautious, as if she were navigating a minefield. She explained that they needed to discuss the tutoring arrangement he had established with Ethan Calloway, that while his intentions were surely good, there were policies and procedures that needed to be followed. Tutors at Lincoln Prep were required to go through a vetting process, background checks, credential verification. The school had a responsibility to ensure that all adults working directly with students met certain standards. Daniel listened without interrupting, though each word felt like a small knife cutting into his dignity. He understood what she was really saying. The issue wasn't about policies or procedures. The issue was that someone in his position had no business teaching the son of someone in Richard Calloway's position. The social order had been disrupted, boundaries had been crossed, and now the system needed to reassert itself, to put everyone back in their proper place. Richard Calloway finally turned from the window. His face was hard, his jaw set, his eyes cold with barely contained anger. When he spoke, his voice was sharp and cutting, each word carefully chosen to wound. He said that he appreciated that Daniel had tried to help Ethan, but that he couldn't allow his son to continue receiving instruction from someone without proper qualifications. He had spent considerable money hiring actual tutors, people with degrees from prestigious universities, people who understood the standards required for Ivy League admission. His son's future was too important to be left in the hands of someone whose job was to clean bathrooms. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Daniel felt them settle over him, felt the familiar sting of being reduced to nothing more than his job title, his worth measured solely by the tasks he performed for minimum wage. He had expected this, had known from the moment he agreed to help Ethan that it could end like this, but hearing it spoken out loud still hurt in ways he hadn't fully prepared for. Part of him wanted to stand up and leave, to walk out of that office with whatever dignity he had left intact. But another part of him, a part that had been growing stronger over the past weeks, refused to be silent this time. Daniel's voice was quiet when he finally spoke, but steady. He said that he understood Mr. Calloway's concerns, that he knew his position at the school was humble, that he had no official credentials to offer as proof of his abilities. But he also said that Ethan had been failing before they started working together, that the expensive tutors Mr. Calloway had hired hadn't been able to help him, and that the progress Ethan had made was real and measurable. He wasn't trying to take credit for anything. He was simply stating facts. Richard Calloway's face darkened. He took a step forward, his presence suddenly more threatening, his body language aggressive. He said that Daniel had no right to make judgments about his son's education, that he had overstepped in ways that were completely inappropriate. Did Daniel have any idea who he was? Did he understand the position he had put the school in by inserting himself into a situation that was none of his business? This wasn't about Ethan's grades. This was about boundaries, about knowing one's place, about respecting the natural hierarchy that existed in institutions like Lincoln Prep. Mrs. Patterson tried to intervene, her voice taking on a placating tone as she attempted to de-escalate the situation. She suggested that perhaps they could find a compromise, that maybe Daniel could continue to help Ethan under the supervision of a certified teacher, that his obvious knowledge of mathematics could be put to use in a more official capacity. But Richard Calloway cut her off mid-sentence, his patience clearly exhausted. He said that there would be no compromise, that he wanted this arrangement ended immediately, and that if the school couldn't enforce its own policies, then he would take Ethan out of Lincoln Prep entirely and enroll him somewhere that understood the importance of maintaining standards. The threat was clear. Lincoln Prep depended on wealthy families like the Calloways for donations, for their reputation, for their continued prestige. Losing a family like that would have consequences that extended far beyond one student's enrollment. Mrs. Patterson's face paled slightly, her professional composure cracking just enough to reveal the pressure she was under. Daniel saw it happen, saw the moment when she made her choice, when institutional survival outweighed whatever personal sympathy she might have felt. She turned to Daniel and asked, in a voice that was both apologetic and firm, if he would agree to stop tutoring Ethan, effective immediately. Daniel sat very still. He thought about Sophia, about the rent that was due in 2 weeks, about the fact that he couldn't afford to lose this job, no matter how much it hurt to sit here and be treated like garbage by a man who had never struggled a day in his life. He thought about Ethan, about the hope that had returned to the boy's eyes, about the confidence that had slowly been rebuilt through their sessions together. He thought about all the hours he had spent teaching himself, keeping his mind sharp, holding on to the part of himself that used to dream of being more than invisible. The silence stretched out again, but this time it was different. This time Daniel was the one making people wait. He looked directly at Richard Calloway, meeting the man's eyes without flinching, without lowering his gaze the way he had been conditioned to do for years. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet strength that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He said that he would stop tutoring Ethan if that was what they wanted, but that he hoped Mr. Calloway would take a moment to actually look at his son's work, to see the real progress that had been made, to consider whether his pride was more important than Ethan's success. Richard Calloway's face flushed red with rage. No one spoke to him that way. No one, especially not a janitor, questioned his decisions or implied that he was putting his own ego ahead of his son's well-being. He opened his mouth to deliver what was surely going to be a devastating response, but before he could speak, there was a knock on the office door. Mrs. Patterson looked irritated at the interruption, clearly wanting to end this meeting as quickly as possible. She called out for whoever it was to come back later, but the door opened anyway. Ethan Calloway stepped into the room. His face was flushed from running, his backpack still slung over one shoulder, his calculus textbook clutched tightly in his hand. He looked at his father, then at Daniel, then at Mrs. Patterson, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. No one had told him about this meeting, but word had spread through the student body the way secrets always do in small communities. Someone had overheard a teacher talking about it in the hallway, and within an hour, Ethan knew that the person who had helped him more than anyone else was being called in to be told to stop. Richard Calloway's expression shifted when he saw his son, surprise mixing with his anger. He told Ethan to leave, that this was an adult conversation and didn't concern him. But Ethan didn't move. Instead, he did something that no one in that room expected. He walked over to Mrs. Patterson's desk and placed his calculus textbook down, opening it to a page covered in his own handwriting, solutions to complex problems worked out in careful detail. His voice shook slightly when he spoke, but the words were clear and deliberate. He said that he needed everyone in the room to understand something. For months, he had been drowning in his calculus class, unable to grasp concepts that seemed to come easily to his classmates, convinced that he was too stupid to succeed no matter how hard he tried. His father had hired 3 different tutors, all with impressive degrees and years of experience, and none of them had been able to help. They had talked at him rather than to him, had made him feel small and inadequate with every session, had treated his struggles as character flaws rather than learning challenges. He had started to believe that maybe he wasn't cut out for the kind of future his father had planned for him. Then Daniel had offered to help, not because he wanted money or recognition, not because he was trying to prove anything to anyone, but simply because he saw a kid struggling and knew he could make a difference. Ethan's voice grew stronger as he spoke, his initial nervousness giving way to something more powerful. He said that Daniel had taught him more in a few weeks than he had learned in months with professional tutors. Not because Daniel had fancy credentials or went to an expensive university, but because he genuinely cared about whether Ethan understood the material. He had been patient, kind, and brilliant in ways that had nothing to do with where he worked or what his job title was. Ethan turned to his father then, his eyes meeting Richard Calloway's with a directness that clearly shocked the older man. He said that he loved his father, that he knew how hard Richard worked to provide opportunities for him, but that he was tired of being treated like a trophy that needed to be polished to perfection. He was tired of tutors who saw him as a problem to be fixed rather than a person to be taught. And he was angry that the one person who had actually helped him was being punished for doing something good. The room fell absolutely silent. Mrs. Patterson looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Richard Calloway stood frozen, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to name. Shock, anger, confusion, and something else, something that might have been shame, flickered across his features. Daniel remained seated, his hands still folded in his lap, his expression carefully neutral, even though his heart was racing. He hadn't expected this, hadn't wanted Ethan to put himself in this position, but he also felt a fierce pride in the courage it took for the boy to stand up to his father in front of strangers. Ethan wasn't finished. He pulled a piece of paper from his backpack, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded it. It was his most recent calculus test, the one he had taken just yesterday. At the top, written in red ink, was a score of 94%, the highest grade he had ever received in the class. He placed it on the desk next to his textbook and said that this was what real teaching looked like. This was what happened when someone believed in him, instead of just expecting him to meet impossible standards. And if his father made Daniel stop tutoring him, then Ethan would refuse to work with anyone else. He would rather fail than go back to feeling worthless. Richard Calloway's mouth opened, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he had no response, no carefully crafted argument, no way to control the situation through force of will. He looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw something he hadn't noticed before. The defeated, anxious boy, who had been walking through life with his shoulders hunched and his eyes downcast, was gone. In his place stood someone with confidence, someone who had found his voice and wasn't afraid to use it. And the person responsible for that transformation was a man Richard had just finished insulting and dismissing as unqualified. Mrs. Patterson finally broke the silence, her voice cautious but measured. She said that perhaps they needed to reconsider the situation, that Ethan's progress was indeed remarkable, and that while there were certainly policies to consider, the school's primary mission was to help students succeed. She looked at Daniel with something approaching respect for the first time since he had entered the office, and asked if he would be willing to continue working with Ethan under more official circumstances. Perhaps they could arrange for him to be compensated as a tutor, to have his work recognized formally rather than kept in the shadows. Daniel wanted to say yes immediately, but caution held him back. He had learned long ago that promises made by institutions to people in his position were often forgotten the moment it became inconvenient to keep them. He asked what exactly that would mean, what kind of arrangement they were proposing, whether this was a genuine offer or just a way to placate an angry student and his concerned father. He needed to know that this wasn't going to result in him being quietly let go a few weeks. Later, when the situation had blown over and no one was paying attention anymore, Mrs. Patterson glanced at Richard Calloway, clearly waiting for him to weigh in, to give his approval or disapproval to whatever arrangement they might make. The CEO stood there, his expensive suit suddenly looking less like armor and more like a costume, his carefully constructed persona of control and authority cracking under the weight of his son's unexpected rebellion. Daniel watched him carefully, trying to read the emotions playing across the man's face, wondering what it must feel like to realize that you had been wrong about something so fundamental, so important. Richard Calloway moved to the window again, but this time his posture was different. His shoulders weren't quite as rigid, his stance not as commanding. He stared out at the soccer field, where students were finishing their practice, their laughter floating up through the glass, carefree and bright. Daniel could see the man's reflection in the window, could see the way his jaw worked, as if he were chewing on words he didn't know how to say. The silence that filled the office now wasn't the same oppressive quiet that had dominated the beginning of the meeting. This was something else entirely, something that felt like the moment before a dam breaks, before everything changes direction. When Richard finally turned around, his face had transformed. The anger was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but it was no longer directed outward. Instead, it seemed to be turning inward, a slow, burning realization that perhaps he had been fighting the wrong battle all along. He looked at Ethan, really looked at his son in a way that suggested he was seeing someone he didn't quite recognize. Someone who had grown and changed while he had been too busy building empires to notice. Richard's voice, when he spoke, was quieter than before, stripped of its earlier aggression. He said that he owed Daniel an apology. The words came out stiffly, as if he were forcing them through a throat that had never been designed for admitting fault. He said that he had made assumptions based on job titles and appearances, that he had dismissed Daniel's capabilities without ever bothering to verify what the man actually knew or understood. He had been operating under the belief that worth could be measured by degrees hanging on walls and salary figures printed on tax returns, and his son had just proven how fundamentally wrong that thinking was. Mrs. Patterson looked as surprised as Daniel felt. In all her years dealing with wealthy parents, she had rarely witnessed someone like Richard Calloway backing down from a position he had taken. These were people who bulldozed through obstacles, who used their influence and resources to reshape reality to match their expectations. They didn't apologize to custodians. They didn't admit they were wrong in front of school administrators and their own children. Yet here was Richard Calloway, one of the most powerful men in Connecticut, doing exactly that. Richard continued, his words coming more easily now, as if once he had started acknowledging the truth, it became impossible to stop. He said that he had been so focused on what he thought success should look like that he had stopped paying attention to whether his son was actually learning anything. He had hired expensive tutors because their credentials looked impressive on paper, because being able to say that Ethan was being taught by someone with a PhD from MIT or Stanford made Richard feel like he was doing his job as a father. But none of those tutors had connected with Ethan the way Daniel apparently had. None of them had taken the time to understand how his son actually learned what he needed to hear in order for concepts to make sense. Ethan stood very still, his test paper and textbook still spread out on Mrs. Patterson's desk, his eyes fixed on his father with an expression that mixed hope and disbelief. Daniel could see the years of pressure written on the boy's face, could see how desperate he was for his father to understand that grades and test scores weren't the only measures of a person's value. This moment mattered more than any calculus problem ever could. This was about whether Richard Calloway could step outside the narrow definition of success that had governed his entire life and see his son as a human being rather than a project to be managed. Richard walked over to the desk and picked up Ethan's test. He studied it carefully, not just glancing at the score, but actually reading through the problems Ethan had solved, examining the work that had gone into achieving that 94%. When he looked up at Daniel, his expression had shifted into something resembling genuine curiosity. He asked, without any trace of condescension this time, what Daniel's background was. Where had he learned mathematics at this level? What qualifications did he actually have that hadn't been mentioned in this conversation? Daniel felt the familiar instinct to minimize himself, to downplay his education and experience, because people in his position weren't supposed to have impressive backgrounds. But something about this moment, about Ethan's courage in standing up for him, made him push past that learned behavior. He sat up a little straighter in his chair and explained that he had completed his undergraduate degree in mathematics with honors, that he had been 3 semesters away from finishing his master's degree when his wife got sick. He talked about the medical bills that had consumed their savings, about the choice he had made to leave graduate school so he could work full-time and take care of Maria during her final months. He mentioned the acceptance letters to PhD programs that still sat in a box under his bed, opportunities he had turned down because survival had taken precedence over ambition. As Daniel spoke, he watched Richard's face change again. The CEO's expression moved through several emotions, settling finally on something that looked uncomfortably close to recognition. Here was a man whose life had been derailed not by lack of ability or effort, but by circumstances beyond his control. Here was someone who had made sacrifices that Richard himself had never been forced to consider because money had always been available to solve his problems. The distance between their two worlds suddenly seemed both vast and remarkably narrow, separated not by intelligence or character, but by the random cruelty of fate. Mrs. Patterson had been quiet throughout this exchange, but now she leaned forward in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her, her expression thoughtful. She said that Lincoln Prep prided itself on hiring the best educators available, people who could inspire students and help them reach their full potential. She looked at Daniel and said that it seemed they had been employing someone with exactly those qualities without ever recognizing it. She asked if he had ever considered teaching officially, if he had any interest in pursuing that path now. The question hung in the air like an impossible dream. Daniel thought about all the nights he had spent at his kitchen table, going through old lesson plans, keeping his mind engaged with mathematics problems because it was the only part of his old life he could still hold on to. He thought about how much joy he had felt working with Ethan, watching concepts click into place, seeing confidence replace despair. Teaching was what he had always wanted to do, what he had been preparing for before everything fell apart. But the path back to that dream seemed impossibly complicated. He would need to finish his degree, go through certification programs, navigate a system that hadn't been designed for people who took 8-year detours into custodial work. Before Daniel could respond, Richard Calloway did something that surprised everyone in the room for the second time that afternoon. He said that if Daniel was willing to continue tutoring Ethan, Richard would personally fund whatever education or certification Daniel needed to become a fully qualified teacher. Not as charity, he was quick to clarify, but as payment for services rendered and an investment in his son's continued success. He would cover the cost of completing the master's degree, pay for certification programs, and ensure that Daniel had the financial support necessary to make the transition from custodian to educator without his daughter suffering in the process. Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat. He had spent so many years convinced that the door to his old dreams had closed permanently, that the life he had once imagined for himself was gone forever. Now here was an opportunity not just to help one student, but potentially to return to the career he had been forced to abandon. It was overwhelming, almost too much to process in the moment. Part of him wondered if this was some kind of test, if accepting help from someone like Richard Calloway would come with strings attached that he couldn't see yet. Ethan's face had lit up with an expression of pure relief and happiness. He looked at his father with something approaching awe, as if seeing him clearly for the first time in years. He looked at Daniel with gratitude that went beyond anything related to calculus or test scores. This was about being seen, about being valued, about adults in his life finally understanding what mattered. His voice was thick with emotion when he said that this was exactly what he had been hoping for, that having Daniel continue as his tutor would mean everything to him. Mrs. Patterson seized on the moment, her administrative instincts kicking in now that a solution was presenting itself. She said that they could work out an arrangement where Daniel would transition from custodial work to an educational support role. He could continue working with Ethan and potentially other students who were struggling in mathematics while he completed his degree and certification. The school would provide him with an office space, include him in faculty meetings, treat him as the professional educator he was training to become. It would be unprecedented, she admitted, but Lincoln Prep had always prided itself on innovation and recognizing talent wherever it appeared. Daniel's mind was racing. This was happening too fast, moving from humiliation to opportunity in the span of a single conversation. He thought about Sophia, about how this change would affect their lives. Better hours would mean he could spend more time with her, help her with her own homework without being exhausted from cleaning all day. The increased income that would come with a teaching position would mean they could finally move out of their cramped one-bedroom apartment, maybe even start saving for her college education. But more than any practical consideration, this represented a chance to reclaim the part of himself he had been forced to set aside, to use his mind and his knowledge to make a real difference in young people's lives. He looked at Richard Calloway and asked the question that needed to be answered before anything else could move forward. Why was the CEO really doing this? Was it genuine belief in Daniel's abilities? Or was it guilt over how he had treated him earlier? Or simply a transaction designed to ensure his son's continued academic success? Daniel had learned to be cautious about gifts from powerful people. They often came with expectations that weren't explicitly stated, obligations that revealed themselves only after you had already accepted the offer. Richard seemed to consider the question carefully before answering. He said that it was probably all three of those things, and maybe some others he hadn't fully examined yet. Yes, he felt guilty about the assumptions he had made and the things he had said. Yes, he wanted Ethan to have the best possible support as he prepared for college applications. But there was also something else, something he was only beginning to understand. He had built his entire career on identifying talent and potential, on recognizing value that others missed and capitalizing on it. Yet when it came to his own son's education, he had been blind to exactly that kind of hidden value because it didn't come in the package he expected. Richard walked over to where Daniel sat and extended his hand. The gesture was formal, but genuine, an acknowledgement of equality that hadn't existed when Daniel first entered the office. He said that he would like to start over, to approach this situation as two men who both cared about Ethan's success rather than as CEO and custodian. He admitted that he had a lot to learn about recognizing worth in people regardless of their circumstances, and that perhaps this situation was exactly the kind of lesson he needed. Daniel stood and shook Richard's hand, feeling the firm grip of someone who was used to sealing deals and making commitments. The physical contact felt surreal, as if he had somehow stepped through a portal into an alternate version of his life, where people like Richard Calloway treated people like him as equals. He said that he would continue tutoring Ethan, that he was grateful for the opportunity to finish his education, but that he needed Richard to understand something important. His goal wasn't to become someone different. He wasn't ashamed of having been a custodian, wasn't trying to escape from that identity as if it was something shameful. The work he had been doing mattered. Someone had to keep the school clean and functional, and there was dignity in that labor, even if society didn't always recognize it. Richard nodded slowly, absorbing this perspective in a way that suggested he had never really thought about it before. He said that he respected that he understood Daniel wasn't looking for rescue, but rather for an opportunity to use different skills he also possessed. The distinction was important, a recognition that people could contain multitudes, that working as a custodian didn't negate intelligence or education, any more than wearing an expensive suit automatically conferred wisdom. Mrs. Patterson began discussing logistics, talking about how they would structure Daniel's transition, what his schedule might look like, how they would handle the inevitable questions from other faculty members about why a custodian was suddenly being treated as a teacher. She was clearly energized by the challenge of making this work, seeing it perhaps as an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of progressive thinking that private schools love to claim but rarely practiced. Daniel listened carefully, making mental notes about timelines and requirements, already thinking about how he would explain this change to Sophia, how he would balance the demands of tutoring with completing his own coursework. Ethan had moved closer to his father, standing beside Richard in a way that suggested a bridge had been built between them during this conversation. The boy's posture had relaxed, his shoulders no longer carrying the weight of impossible expectations. He asked Daniel when they could schedule their next tutoring session, his voice eager and hopeful. There was calculus homework due next week, and he wanted to make sure he stayed on track with the progress they had been making. The normalcy of the question, the simple focus on schoolwork after everything that had just transpired, made everyone in the room smile. Daniel said they could meet the next afternoon if Ethan wanted, back in their usual corner of the library. Some things didn't need to change just because the circumstances around them had shifted. Ethan agreed enthusiastically, already pulling out his phone to add it to his calendar. Richard watched this interaction with an expression that mixed pride and something that might have been envy, as if he wished he could be part of these tutoring sessions, could witness firsthand the transformation that happened when his son worked with someone who truly understood how to reach him. As the meeting drew to a close, Mrs. Patterson stood and said that she would draw up the necessary paperwork to formalize Daniel's new role at the school. It would take a few days to work through the administrative details, but she was confident they could have everything in place by the following week. She thanked everyone for their flexibility and willingness to think creatively about how to best serve Ethan's needs. Her tone suggested that she was already planning how to present this story to the school board as an example of Lincoln Prep's commitment to innovative education and recognizing excellence regardless of its source. Daniel left the office in a daze, his mind struggling to process everything that had happened in the past hour. He had walked in expecting to be told he was fired, or at minimum that he needed to stop helping Ethan and stay in his lane. Instead, he was walking out with an opportunity to completely transform his life, to return to the career path he thought had been permanently closed off to him. As he made his way back through the halls of Lincoln Prep, past the photographs of distinguished alumni, he felt different somehow, as if the space he occupied in the world had subtly expanded. Other staff members passed him in the corridor, and he wondered if they could see the change, if there was something visible in his face or posture that reflected what had just occurred. Most of them probably still saw just the custodian, the man who emptied their trash and mopped their floors. But Daniel knew that perception would shift soon enough. Word would spread about the unusual arrangement, about the janitor who turned out to have nearly completed a master's degree, about Richard Calloway personally funding his return to education. Some would be supportive, excited about the unconventional story. Others would be skeptical or resentful, uncomfortable with someone moving outside their designated role in the school's social hierarchy. He thought about calling Sophia's school to let her know he might be late picking her up, but then decided against it. He wanted to tell her about this in person, wanted to see her face when he explained that their lives were about to change in ways neither of them had imagined possible. She had been so patient with their struggles, so understanding when he was too tired to help with her homework, or when they had to skip activities because money was tight. Now he would be able to tell her that things were going to get better, that the sacrifices they had made were finally leading somewhere. Daniel collected his cleaning supplies from the closet where he had left them that morning. But instead of immediately returning to work, he stood there for a moment, looking at the mop and bucket, the industrial cleaner and rags that had been his tools for 8 years. These objects had defined his daily existence, had been the instruments of his invisibility. Yet they had also been part of the journey that led him to this moment. If he hadn't been cleaning that hallway outside Mrs. Patterson's office, he never would have overheard the argument about Ethan's grades. If he hadn't been emptying trash in the library, he never would have seen the boy struggling alone with his calculus textbook. Sometimes the path to change required walking through places that seemed like dead ends. The following weeks unfolded like a dream Daniel kept expecting to wake from. Every morning he arrived at Lincoln, Prep still uncertain whether the promises made in Mrs. Patterson's office would actually materialize, or quietly evaporate once the initial emotion of that afternoon had faded. But Richard Calloway proved to be a man who followed through on his commitments. Within 3 days, Daniel received an official letter from the school outlining his new position as Educational Support Specialist, a title that had been created specifically for his unique circumstances. The letter detailed his responsibilities, his salary, which was nearly triple what he had been earning as a custodian, and the timeline for his transition into the role. The practical changes came swiftly. Daniel was assigned a small office on the 2nd floor, tucked between the math department and the science labs. It wasn't large, barely big enough for a desk, 2 chairs and a bookshelf, but it had a window that looked out over the courtyard and a door he could close when working with students. The first time he sat down at that desk, in a chair that was actually comfortable instead of the metal folding ones he was used to, he had to take a moment to steady himself. The weight of 8 years spent being invisible, of scrubbing floors while others walked past him without seeing, pressed against this new reality until he wasn't sure which version of his life was real. Mrs. Patterson scheduled a faculty meeting to introduce Daniel's new role to the staff. He had dreaded that meeting for days, anticipating the skepticism and resistance he would face from teachers who had barely acknowledged his existence when he was cleaning their classrooms. The meeting took place on a Wednesday afternoon in the library, with 23 faculty members arranged in a loose semicircle around the central tables. Daniel stood at the front beside Mrs. Patterson, acutely aware of how different he looked now. He wore dress pants and a button-down shirt instead of his custodial uniform. But he wondered if the teachers saw the change, or just the person who used to empty their trash cans. Mrs. Patterson explained the situation carefully, framing it as an innovative approach to student support rather than an admission that they had been employing someone with advanced mathematics training to clean bathrooms for nearly a decade. She talked about Daniel's educational background, his nearly completed master's degree, and the remarkable progress Ethan Callaway had made under his guidance. She emphasized that Lincoln Prep had always prided itself on recognizing talent, and that Daniel's transition from custodial staff to educational specialist demonstrated the school's commitment to that principle. The reactions varied. Some teachers, particularly the younger ones, seemed genuinely excited about the unconventional story. They asked Daniel questions about his approach to tutoring, his teaching philosophy, whether he would be available to help other struggling students. A few of the veteran faculty members looked less convinced, their expressions ranging from polite skepticism to thinly veiled disapproval. Daniel could read their thoughts clearly enough. He was breaking an unspoken rule, crossing a boundary that separated those who taught from those who cleaned up after them. His presence in their professional space felt like an intrusion, a disruption to the natural order of things. One teacher in particular, Mr. Harrison, who had taught mathematics at Lincoln Prep for over 20 years, asked pointed questions about Daniel's qualifications. What specific coursework had he completed? Which university had he attended? What pedagogical training did he have beyond his own graduate studies? The questions weren't inherently inappropriate, but the tone in which they were delivered made it clear that Mr. Harrison saw Daniel as someone who needed to prove himself rather than as a colleague who brought valuable skills to the department. Daniel answered each question thoroughly and honestly, refusing to be defensive or apologetic about his background. He talked about the courses he had taken, the research he had been involved in before leaving graduate school, the independent study he had maintained over the years to keep his knowledge current. He acknowledged that he lacked formal teaching certification, but pointed out that he would be completing that requirement as part of his transition plan. He also mentioned carefully but firmly that his real qualification was his ability to help students who were struggling, to make complex concepts accessible, to meet learners where they were rather than where a curriculum said they should be. The tension in the room was palpable, but before Mr. Harrison could press further, another teacher spoke up. Mrs. Chen, who taught junior-level calculus, said that she had noticed a dramatic change in Ethan Callaway's performance and attitude over the past month. As someone who had taught the boy the previous year and witnessed his struggles firsthand, she wanted to know what Daniel was doing differently that had produced such remarkable results. Her question wasn't challenging. It was genuinely curious, perhaps even a little hopeful. Daniel explained his approach without pretension or jargon. He talked about taking time to understand how individual students processed information, about breaking down complex problems into smaller components that built on each other logically, about creating a safe space where struggling with difficult material wasn't seen as failure, but as a natural part of learning. He mentioned that many students who struggled in mathematics had been taught to see it as something you were either naturally good at or hopelessly bad at, and that his goal was to dismantle that false dichotomy. Math was a skill that could be developed with the right support and encouragement, not a genetic lottery that determined who got to succeed. As he spoke, Daniel noticed some of the skeptical expressions softening. Teachers, regardless of their initial reservations, recognized authentic passion for education when they heard it. Miss Chen nodded along with his explanation, and several other faculty members leaned forward in their seats, engaged despite their earlier doubts. Even Mr. Harrison's stern expression had relaxed slightly, though he still didn't look entirely convinced that a former custodian belonged in their ranks. After the faculty meeting ended, several teachers approached Daniel individually. Some offered congratulations and support. Others asked if he would be willing to work with their struggling students, mentioning specific kids who were failing or barely passing despite hours of tutoring from other sources. Ms. Chen invited him to observe one of her calculus classes, suggesting that collaboration between them might benefit students who were having difficulty. The warmth of these interactions surprised Daniel. He had expected more resistance, more questions about whether he truly belonged in this new role. But not everyone was welcoming. As Daniel gathered his materials to leave the library, Mr. Harrison intercepted him near the door. The older teacher's expression was carefully neutral, but his words carried an edge that couldn't be mistaken for anything other than a warning. He said that Lincoln Prep had standards, that the families who paid substantial tuition expected their children to be taught by credentialed professionals with proven track records. One success story with the CEO's son was impressive, certainly, but it didn't necessarily translate to broader teaching competence. Daniel would need to prove himself repeatedly, Mr. Harrison suggested, and any missteps would be scrutinized carefully. Daniel met the older man's gaze without flinching. He said that he understood the concerns, that he had no intention of taking his new position for granted, and that he welcomed being held to high standards because he intended to meet them. But he also said something that made Mr. Harrison's eyebrows rise slightly. He pointed out that having credentials and teaching effectively weren't always the same thing, that some of the most qualified people on paper could still fail to connect with struggling students, and that perhaps Lincoln Prep students would benefit from having educators with diverse backgrounds and approaches, rather than everyone following the same traditional path. The conversation ended there, neither antagonistic nor friendly, simply an acknowledgement that Daniel's place in the faculty was going to be complicated. As he walked through the hallways toward his new office, Daniel realized that he was navigating territory that was simultaneously familiar and completely foreign. He knew these corridors intimately, had cleaned every inch of them, but now he was walking through them as a different person, or rather as the same person being seen differently. Students who had never noticed him before now nodded in greeting. Teachers held doors open for him. The secretary in the main office called him Mr. Torres instead of just Daniel. That evening, when he picked up Sophia from her after-school program, he was earlier than usual and not exhausted for the first time in years. His daughter noticed immediately, commenting on how he looked different, more relaxed, less worn down. They went out for dinner, something they rarely did because money had always been too tight, and Daniel told her everything that had happened over the past weeks. He explained about Ethan, about the confrontation with Richard Calloway, about the opportunity to finish his degree and become a real teacher. Sophia's reaction was pure joy mixed with tears. She was 12 years old, but mature beyond her years, shaped by circumstances that had forced her to grow up faster than she should have. She told her father that she had always known he was smart, that she had seen the math books he studied late at night when he thought she was asleep, that she had heard the frustration in his voice when he talked about the career he had given up. Now he was getting a chance to reclaim that dream, and she couldn't be happier for him. Her pride in him was overwhelming, a reminder of why he had endured so many years of difficult work without complaint. The tutoring sessions with Ethan continued, but they evolved as the boy's confidence grew. What had started as emergency intervention for a failing student had transformed into something more collaborative. Ethan no longer approached calculus with dread, but with genuine curiosity. He asked questions that went beyond the curriculum, wanting to understand not just how to solve problems, but why the mathematical principles worked the way they did. Daniel found himself challenged in ways he hadn't expected, forced to think deeply about concepts he had taken for granted, to find new ways of explaining ideas that he understood intuitively, but had never needed to articulate clearly. Richard Calloway kept his promise about funding Daniel's education. A week after the faculty meeting, Daniel received information about enrolling in an accelerated master's program at a nearby university. The program was designed for working professionals and would allow him to complete his degree within 18 months while maintaining his tutoring responsibilities at Lincoln. Prep Richard's company had arranged to cover all tuition fees and textbook costs, as well as providing a stipend to ensure Daniel didn't face financial hardship during the intensive study period. The first night of classes was intimidating. Daniel walked onto a university campus for the first time in 8 years, surrounded by students who were younger and who hadn't experienced the kind of interruption that had derailed his original graduate studies. He felt out of place initially, worried that he wouldn't be able to keep up after so long away from formal academic work. But once the professor started lecturing, once Daniel opened his notebook and began working through problems, something clicked back into place. His mind, which had been kept sharp through years of independent study, engaged with the material eagerly, hungrily even, making connections and seeing patterns that some of his younger classmates struggled to grasp. His professors quickly recognized that Daniel wasn't a typical student. During office hours, they would engage him in discussions that went well beyond the coursework, curious about his background and his perspectives. When they learned about his journey from graduate school to custodial work and back to education, their respect deepened. Several of them mentioned that his life experience would make him a more effective teacher than many people who had followed straight academic paths. That understanding struggle and sacrifice gave him insights into student challenges that couldn't be taught in pedagogy courses. Back at Lincoln Prep, word of Daniel's story had spread beyond the faculty. Students began approaching him in the hallways, some asking for help with mathematics, others simply wanting to tell him that his story had inspired them. Several students from modest backgrounds, scholarship recipients who felt out of place among their wealthy peers, sought him out specifically. They saw in Daniel a reflection of their own experiences with feeling invisible, with being judged based on circumstances rather than capabilities. His presence at the school sent a message that transformation was possible, that where you started didn't have to determine where you ended up. One student in particular, a sophomore named Marcus, who was struggling with geometry, became a regular visitor to Daniel's office. The boy came from a working-class family and was at Lincoln Prep on a full scholarship. He had been failing geometry and was terrified of losing his scholarship, of having to return to his overcrowded public school where he felt lost in classes of 35 students. Marcus reminded Daniel so much of himself at that age, bright but unsure, capable but convinced he didn't belong in a place like Lincoln Prep. Daniel worked with Marcus twice a week, and the transformation was similar to what had happened with Ethan. The boy's grades improved steadily as his confidence grew. But more than that, Marcus began to carry himself differently. He stopped apologizing for asking questions. He participated more in class. He made friends with other students who had previously intimidated him. Daniel watched this metamorphosis with a satisfaction that went beyond academic achievement. He was helping this young person see himself differently, recognize his own worth, understand that intelligence and potential weren't distributed according to wealth or social class. The weeks turned into months, and Daniel's life settled into a new rhythm. Mornings were spent working with students at Lincoln Prep. Afternoons and evenings were divided between his university classes and homework. The schedule was demanding. more intellectually exhausting than his custodial work had been physically draining. But Daniel welcomed the challenge. He was using his mind again, engaging with material that excited him, making a difference in ways that felt meaningful and lasting. Richard Calloway had remained involved in an unexpected way. The CEO began stopping by Daniel's office periodically, sometimes to check on Ethan's progress, but increasingly just to talk. These conversations ranged from discussions about education to broader philosophical questions about success, purpose, and what it meant to live a life that mattered. Daniel got the sense that Richard was going through his own transformation, that the encounter in Mrs. Patterson's office had forced him to examine assumptions he had carried his entire adult life. During one of these conversations, Richard admitted something that clearly cost him effort to say. He confessed that his own father had been a factory worker who had died in an industrial accident when Richard was 15. Richard had built his empire partly to prove something to a world that had valued his father so little, but in the process, he had adopted the very prejudices that had devalued his father's work. Meeting Daniel, seeing someone with enormous intellectual gifts working as a custodian, not out of inability, but because circumstances had forced that choice, had been like looking into a mirror that showed him something he didn't want to see about himself. Daniel listened to this confession without judgment. He understood that people were complex, that the same person could contain both prejudice and compassion, arrogance and humility, depending on the circumstances. Richard was clearly trying to become better, to learn from his mistakes, and that effort deserved acknowledgement, even if the original behavior had been hurtful. Daniel shared his own struggles with resentment, admitting that there had been times when he had felt bitter about people like Richard who had never faced the choices he had been forced to make. But he had learned that bitterness was a poison that hurt the person carrying it more than anyone else, and that finding peace required accepting that life was fundamentally unfair while still choosing to be kind anyway. These conversations between them became something neither man had expected, a genuine friendship. Not one based on equality of resources or social standing, but on mutual respect and shared recognition of human complexity. Richard sought Daniel's advice on how to better communicate with Ethan, how to show support without imposing expectations. Daniel appreciated Richard's perspective on navigating institutional politics at Lincoln Prep, understanding which battles were worth fighting and which were better avoided. Ethan's college application season arrived with the intensity of the approaching storm. The boy was applying to several Ivy League schools, with Harvard at the top of his list. His grades were now strong, his calculus work particularly impressive, but the competition for admission to elite universities remained brutal. Ethan was anxious in a way that reminded Daniel of how the boy had been when they first started working together, though this anxiety was different. It wasn't rooted in self-doubt about his abilities, but in the uncertainty that came from wanting something intensely, while knowing that factors beyond his control would determine the outcome. Daniel helped Ethan with more than just mathematics during this period. They talked about his college essays, about how to present himself authentically, rather than trying to guess what admissions officers wanted to hear. Daniel encouraged Ethan to write about his struggles with calculus and what he had learned from that experience, about the value of persistence and the importance of finding the right kind of help rather than just assuming failure was inevitable. Ethan's main essay ended up being about how a custodian had taught him more about education than any formal teacher ever had, about learning to see value in people regardless of their job titles or social status. Richard read the essay and called Daniel afterward, his voice thick with emotion. He said that his son had become someone he was truly proud of, not because of grades or test scores, but because Ethan had developed character, compassion, and the ability to think independently. Those qualities, Richard admitted, were more valuable than any Ivy League degree, though he certainly hoped his son got into Harvard anyway. They both laughed at that, acknowledging the tension between wanting to believe that character mattered most while still valuing traditional markers of success. The waiting period after applications were submitted was difficult for everyone. Ethan checked his email obsessively, jumping every time his phone buzzed. Richard tried to maintain his usual confident demeanor, but Daniel could see the anxiety underneath. Even Daniel felt nervous, though he tried not to show it. He had invested so much emotional energy in Ethan's success, had seen the boy transform from defeated and hopeless to confident and capable. The idea that a rejection letter could undermine that growth worried him, even though he knew intellectually that college admissions decisions didn't define a person's worth. During this waiting period, something happened that reminded everyone at Lincoln Prep of how Daniel's presence had changed the school's culture. Mr. Harrison, the veteran mathematics teacher who had been skeptical of Daniel's qualifications, approached him one afternoon with an unusual request. He had a student, a senior named Jennifer, who was failing his AP Calculus class despite being intelligent and hard-working. Mr. Harrison had tried everything he knew to help her, but nothing seemed to work. He wondered if Daniel might be willing to meet with Jennifer to see if his approach might succeed where traditional methods had failed. The request was significant because it represented Mr. Harrison's acknowledgement that Daniel had something valuable to offer, that his unconventional path to teaching hadn't disqualified him, but had perhaps given him insights that traditionally trained educators lacked. Daniel agreed immediately, and he began working with Jennifer twice a week. Within a month, her grades had improved dramatically. She went from failing to earning a B+, and more importantly, she stopped seeing mathematics as an enemy she had to defeat, and started viewing it as a challenge she could overcome with the right strategies. Mr. Harrison thanked Daniel publicly during a department meeting, praising his ability to reach struggling students and suggesting that other teachers might benefit from observing his methods. The gesture was gracious and genuinely meant, a sign that even the most skeptical members of the faculty had come to accept Daniel as a legitimate colleague. Daniel felt a sense of belonging at Lincoln Prep that he had never experienced during his years as a custodian, a feeling that his presence mattered not just for what he did, but for who he was. The acceptance letters from colleges began arriving in late March. Ethan heard back from several schools, receiving acceptances from Brown, Cornell, and Duke. Each letter was cause for celebration, a proof that his hard work had paid off and that his future was full of possibilities. But the letter he was waiting for, the one from Harvard, hadn't arrived. Days passed with no word, and Ethan's anxiety intensified. Richard tried to reassure him that he had already gotten into several excellent schools, that Harvard wasn't the only path to success. But father and son both knew that Harvard had become symbolic of something larger, a validation that all the struggle and growth had been worthwhile. Finally, on a Tuesday afternoon in early April, the email arrived. Ethan was in Daniel's office, working through practice problems for his upcoming AP exam, when his phone buzzed with a notification. He looked at the screen, his face going pale, his hands starting to shake. Daniel asked what was wrong, concerned that something bad had happened. Ethan couldn't speak. He just turned his phone around so Daniel could see the subject line of the email: "Congratulations from Harvard College." The silence in Daniel's office lasted only a heartbeat before Ethan let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped his phone as he opened the email to read the full message. Daniel came around the desk and read over the boy's shoulder, his own heart pounding as he saw the words that confirmed what the subject line had promised. Ethan Calloway had been accepted to Harvard University's class of 2029. The letter praised his academic improvement, his compelling personal essay, and his demonstrated commitment to growth and learning. Ethan turned to Daniel, tears streaming down his face, and did something that caught them both off guard. He hugged him. Not a polite handshake or a formal gesture of gratitude, but a full embrace from a teenager who had spent months believing he was destined to fail, and had just received proof that he was capable of achieving something extraordinary. Daniel hugged him back, feeling his own eyes burning with emotion. This wasn't just about college admission. This was about a young person discovering that his worth wasn't defined by his struggles, that asking for help wasn't weakness, that growth was possible even when everything seemed hopeless. They stayed like that for a moment before Ethan pulled back, wiping his eyes and laughing at himself for crying. He immediately called his father, his voice shaking with excitement as he delivered the news. Daniel could hear Richard's shout of joy even through the phone, could hear the emotion in the CEO's voice as he congratulated his son. Richard said he was leaving work immediately, that he would be at the school in 15 minutes, that they needed to celebrate this moment properly. When Richard arrived at Lincoln Prep, he didn't go to Mrs. Patterson's office or request a formal meeting. He came directly to Daniel's small office on the second floor, still wearing his business suit, but with his tie loosened and his normally controlled expression broken by genuine happiness. He shook Daniel's hand with both of his own, holding on longer than necessary, his gratitude too large for simple words. He said that this acceptance letter belonged as much to Daniel as it did to Ethan, that without Daniel's intervention and patient teaching, none of this would have been possible. Daniel tried to deflect the praise, saying that Ethan had done the actual work, that all he had provided was guidance and support. But Richard wouldn't let him minimize his contribution. He pointed out that plenty of people had tried to help Ethan before Daniel came along, that expensive tutors with impressive credentials had failed where Daniel succeeded, and that the difference had been Daniel's ability to see Ethan as a person rather than a problem to be solved. That quality, Richard insisted, was rare and valuable and deserved to be acknowledged. Mrs. Patterson heard about the acceptance within the hour and called Daniel to her office. Her expression was warm, genuinely pleased, in a way that went beyond institutional pride. She said that Ethan's success reflected well on Lincoln Prep, certainly, but more than that, it validated the risk she had taken in supporting Daniel's unconventional transition from custodian to educator. She had faced questions from some board members about the appropriateness of the arrangement, concerns about setting precedents that might complicate future staffing decisions. Now she had concrete proof that talent and dedication mattered more than traditional credentialing, at least in some cases. She also told Daniel something that surprised him. Several other families had approached her asking if Daniel might be available to work with their children. Word had spread among Lincoln Prep parents about the custodian-turned-tutor who had helped Richard Calloway's failing son get into Harvard. These weren't just families with struggling students. Some were parents of high-achieving kids who wanted Daniel's perspective precisely because his approach was different from the conventional tutoring their children had always received. Mrs. Patterson asked if Daniel would be interested in expanding his tutoring practice, possibly even developing it into a formal program at the school. Daniel said he needed to think about it. His master's degree program was demanding, and he was already stretched thin between his coursework, his existing students, and his responsibilities to Sophia. But the idea intrigued him. He had discovered something about himself over these past months, something he had suspected during his original graduate studies, but hadn't been able to confirm until now. He loved teaching not as an abstract concept, but as an actual practice. He loved the moment when understanding dawned in a student's eyes, when confusion gave way to clarity, when someone who had been convinced they were incapable suddenly realized they could succeed. The news of Ethan's Harvard acceptance spread through Lincoln Prep quickly. Students congratulated him in the hallways. Teachers who had watched his transformation offered their praise. Even students who didn't know Ethan personally had heard the story of his dramatic academic turnaround and felt inspired by it. The narrative that circulated wasn't just about a rich kid getting into an elite school. It was about someone who had been failing, who had been written off as not smart enough or not dedicated enough, proving everyone wrong through hard work and the right kind of support. For Daniel, the attention was uncomfortable at first. He'd spent 8 years trying to be invisible, perfecting the art of moving through spaces without drawing notice. Now people sought him out specifically, wanted to hear his story, asked him questions about his teaching philosophy and his background. Some of this attention was positive, but some of it felt invasive, as if his personal struggles had become public property now that they had led to a feel-good outcome. He had to learn how to set boundaries, how to share enough to be authentic without exposing parts of himself that remained tender and private. Sophia noticed the change in her father's public profile and had mixed feelings about it. She was proud of him, thrilled that he was getting recognition for his intelligence and hard work after so many years of being overlooked. But she also worried about how the increased visibility might affect their lives. They had always been private people, content with their small circle and their quiet existence. Now strangers knew their story, had opinions about Daniel's journey from custodian to educator, saw him as a symbol of something larger than himself. Daniel reassured his daughter that the core of their lives wouldn't change. Yes, his work was different now, and yes, people saw him differently. But he was still the same person who made her breakfast every morning, who helped with her homework at the kitchen table, who tucked her in at night, even though she was probably too old for that. The external circumstances had shifted, but their relationship, their values, their commitment to each other remained constant. Sophia seemed to accept this, though Daniel could see that she was processing the changes in her own way, figuring out what it meant to be the daughter of someone who was no longer invisible. The end of the school year brought a series of events that marked the conclusion of one chapter and the beginning of another. Ethan graduated from Lincoln Prep with honors, his turnaround story mentioned in the commencement speech delivered by Mrs. Patterson. She talked about the importance of perseverance, the value of seeking help when struggling, and the surprising places where wisdom and guidance could be found. She didn't mention Daniel by name, but everyone in the audience knew who she was referring to. Daniel sat in the back row during the ceremony, wearing the same suit he had worn to his wife's funeral years ago, watching as Ethan walked across the stage to receive his diploma. After the ceremony, during the reception on the school lawn, Richard found Daniel and pulled him aside. He said that he had been thinking a lot about legacy lately, about what he wanted to leave behind when his time came. Building a successful company was an accomplishment, certainly, but it felt hollow compared to the impact Daniel had made on Ethan's life. Richard wanted to do something meaningful, something that would extend Daniel's influence beyond the individual students he could tutor personally. He proposed establishing a scholarship fund at Lincoln Prep specifically for students from working-class families, students who might not otherwise be able to afford the school's tuition. But more than just financial support, Richard wanted to create a mentorship program that paired these scholarship students with adults who had overcome similar challenges. He wanted Daniel to help design and run this program, to use his own experience to guide young people who were navigating worlds they hadn't been born into, who felt out of place in institutions designed for wealth and privilege. Daniel was moved by the proposal, but cautious about the execution. He said that scholarship programs were wonderful in theory, but often failed in practice because they didn't address the deeper challenges that working-class students faced in elite environments. It wasn't enough to give them money for tuition. They needed support systems that helped them navigate social dynamics, cultural differences, and the psychological burden of feeling like they didn't belong. The mentorship component was crucial, but it had to be done thoughtfully, with mentors who understood that their role wasn't to fix students, but to empower them to succeed on their own terms. Richard listened carefully and agreed to let Daniel take the lead on designing the program. They would fund it generously, provide whatever resources were necessary, but the philosophical approach and practical implementation would be guided by Daniel's insights and experience. This felt right to Daniel, like a way of taking his own difficult journey and transforming it into something that could benefit others facing similar challenges. He accepted the role, knowing it would add another layer of responsibility to his already full schedule, but unable to refuse an opportunity to make a difference on a larger scale. Summer arrived, bringing with it a brief respite from the intensity of the school year. Daniel completed his spring semester coursework with excellent grades, surprising even himself with how naturally he had slipped back into academic life. His professors continued to express admiration for his work, and one of them suggested that Daniel consider pursuing a PhD after completing his master's degree. The idea seemed absurd at first, impossibly ambitious for someone who had spent 8 years cleaning floors. But as Daniel thought about it more, he realized that absurdity was just another word for something that challenged conventional expectations. And his entire life over the past year had been about proving that conventional expectations were often wrong. He spent part of the summer working on the scholarship and mentorship program with Richard, developing guidelines and structures that would make it effective rather than just well-intentioned. They interviewed potential mentors, created application materials for prospective scholarship recipients, and met with Mrs. Patterson repeatedly to ensure the program would integrate smoothly with Lincoln Prep's existing systems. The work was fulfilling in ways that surprised Daniel. He was building something that would outlast his direct involvement, creating a legacy that might help countless students he would never meet personally. Ethan left for Harvard in late August, nervous but excited about the new chapter ahead of him. Before he left, he came to Daniel's apartment to say goodbye. Sophia was home, and she sat quietly while Ethan thanked her father for everything he had done. Ethan said that he knew the tutoring had been important, that the academic help had been crucial, but that the real gift Daniel had given him was the belief that he was capable of more than he had thought possible. That lesson, Ethan said, would stay with him long after he had forgotten specific calculus formulas or mathematical theorems. Daniel walked Ethan out to his car, and they stood together in the parking lot of the modest apartment complex where Daniel still lived despite his improved income. Ethan looked around at the peeling paint on the building's exterior, the cracked pavement, the modest cars parked in numbered spaces, and Daniel could see him processing the contrast between this place and the world Ethan came from. The boy said something then that showed how much he had grown. He said that he used to think success meant never having to live in a place like this, that the whole point of ambition was to escape from modest circumstances into luxury and comfort. But now he understood that dignity and worth existed independent of zip codes and bank account balances, that some of the strongest people he knew had very little money, and that his future success would be measured not by how much wealth he accumulated, but by how much good he did with whatever resources he had. When fall arrived and Daniel returned to Lincoln Prep for his second year as an educator, everything felt different. He was no longer the new anomaly, the custodian who had somehow become a teacher. He was simply Mr. Torres, a respected member of the faculty, known for his ability to help struggling students and his thoughtful approach to education. The scholarship program launched with its first cohort of 5 students, all from working-class families, all bright and capable, but uncertain about whether they belonged in a place like Lincoln Prep. Daniel met with each of them individually, sharing parts of his own story, helping them understand that feeling out of place didn't mean they were actually out of place, that everyone's path to success looked different. One afternoon in October, exactly 1 year after the meeting in Mrs. Patterson's office that had changed everything, Daniel was walking through the hallways of Lincoln Prep between classes. He passed the custodial closet where he used to store his supplies, where he used to change into his work uniform every morning. The door was open, and he could see the new custodian inside, a middle-aged woman named Carmen, who had taken over his old position. She was organizing cleaning supplies, preparing for her afternoon rounds, doing the work that Daniel had once done. He stopped and introduced himself, asked her how she was adjusting to the job, whether she needed anything. Carmen looked surprised that a teacher was talking to her, clearly not used to being noticed by faculty members. She said the work was fine, that she needed the job and was grateful to have it, but that it was hard being invisible, being the person people looked past rather than at. Daniel understood completely. He told her that he had worked that same job for 8 years, that he knew exactly what she meant, and that if she ever needed someone to talk to or help with anything, his office was on the second floor and his door was always open. Carmen's expression shifted from surprise to something deeper, a recognition that she had been seen, really seen, perhaps for the first time since taking the position. She thanked him quietly, and Daniel continued on his way, but the encounter stayed with him. He thought about how easy it would be to forget where he had come from now that his circumstances had changed, to adopt the same blindness toward service workers that had once made him invisible. He made a silent promise to himself that he would never let that happen, that his awareness of how society devalued certain kinds of work would remain sharp regardless of how his own career evolved. That evening, as Daniel sat at his kitchen table helping Sophia with her algebra homework, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. A year ago, he had been a janitor, exhausted and invisible, convinced that the dreams he had once held were permanently out of reach. Now he was a teacher, a mentor, a graduate student, and the architect of a program designed to help students who reminded him of his younger self. The transformation hadn't erased the pain of the years he had spent cleaning floors, hadn't made those sacrifices disappear or rendered them meaningless. But it had proved that endings weren't always permanent, that doors that seemed closed could sometimes open again in unexpected ways. The real lesson, though, wasn't about individual transformation or redemption. It was about the countless people like Carmen, like the person he had been a year ago, who possessed talents and knowledge and potential that no one bothered to recognize because they worked in positions society had decided were beneath notice. How many brilliant minds were emptying trash cans or mopping floors, their abilities invisible to people who never thought to look past job titles? How many young people were failing, not because they lacked intelligence, but because no one had taken the time to teach them in ways that matched how they actually learned? These questions had no easy answers, but they drove Daniel's work now. Every student he helped, every scholarship recipient he mentored, every conversation he had with teachers about recognizing potential in unlikely places was his way of fighting against the systems that created and perpetuated invisibility. The story of a custodian who became a teacher, of a failing student who got into Harvard, had become something larger than either of them. It had become a reminder that human worth couldn't be measured by conventional metrics, that transformation was possible, and that sometimes the people society valued least had the most to teach everyone else. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.